Hey, what's going on guys? Jake Verdant Tech here, back with another video. Today we're going to be looking at the RISE4 button remap kit from eXtremeRate. This is a programmable rear paddle kit for the PS5 controller. Throughout all the gaming I've done, I've mostly been on Xbox or Nintendo controllers. Recently, a friend of mine did mention that in his opinion, the PS5 controller is far superior than the current Xbox controller. So I thought I'd give one a shot. And since we've done other rear button mod kits for the Xbox controllers on this channel, I figured we might as well do it for the PS5 controller. So starting off with the installation, we're just going to go ahead and pop off the bumpers. You can just use any sort of pry tool, kind of lift under them, and they come right off very easily. Now we're going to work on separating the plastics, kind of the front and rear, and there's a center trim piece. For this, we're going to kind of start at the bottom corner of one of the handles, and you can use any sort of pry tool, and you're essentially just trying to work the seam until it comes apart. The center trim piece mentioned will lift out around the joysticks, and just be careful because there are little points that go up around the start select button of the controller. In the bottom corners of the handles, there is going to be a couple of screws that you'll need to remove. In this case, just one on each side. Next, we're going to work on separating the top half of the housing from the bottom half of the housing of the controller. And there's two little latches right by the microphone jack. So we're going to lift up on those just to start the separation of the two halves. And then it's going to be more work with our pry tool, just kind of going around the seam of the controller until we get all the body clips unclipped and the controller halves separate. Now that you're inside the controller, you can go ahead and detach the battery. There will just be one plug on the right side, and you can unhook it from there and pull out the battery. And for this installation, because I do want to be able to map the button presses on the joystick, we are going to remove the battery tray. So there's going to be one screw in the middle, and that'll give us the full access to the board. And as you can see, there are more ribbon cables surrounding the board. Go ahead and remove these, as we are going to need to lift up the board and flip it out of the way in order to get our contact ribbon cable installed on the back side. For now, on the visible side of the board, we're just going to be installing a included ribbon cable with this RISE4 kit. This is an optional step, but what it's going to allow us to do is actually map the L3 and R3 joystick buttons to the rear paddle kit. Like I mentioned, this is optional, but for me, I really wanted to go ahead and solder this in. So as you can see, we're going to line it up with the contacts on the rear, which you can see this is the backside of where the joysticks would sit. So there's a contacts for each spot. So there's only two solder points. We're going to solder those up and we'll be good to go. I definitely recommend using some sort of Kapton tape to hold the ribbon cable in place that you're trying to solder, as it is kind of hard to work with and solder if you don't have it already applied by something. Once that's soldered up, or if you're skipping this step, go ahead and gently lift up on the board. We're going to want to get to technically the top side that's facing the upward side of the controller. So we're going to just want to lift gently and flip it out of the way. There's going to be a set of contacts on the bottom that we're going to want to apply our eXtremeRate ribbon cable to, and that's going to have most of the button mapping controls built into it. So you can see the contacts kind of on the right side of the controller, and there's a couple knobs. our additional ribbon cable will actually slot right into that and just press up against it. And that's the way it's going to make its contact. So pretty neat. Not much soldering required for this mod. Really the only soldering that's required is optional, whether you want the map select button available to map to the rear buttons or the, as we did, the L3 and R3 buttons. Other than that, everything is pretty much controlled through this ribbon cable here. Once the ribbon cable is pressed down securely, you can go ahead and rotate the board back to where it normally sits. And you can reapply all the ribbon cables that we detached to flip this board over. From there, you can go ahead and screw back in the battery tray and reattach the battery. And as you're doing this, make sure the tag end to the main ribbon cable is still visible, as that's going to have to route through the controller into the button kit. And thankfully there is some two-sided tape which allows you to flip over the ribbon cable and apply it to the battery so it's nice and secure. And as you can see, there is a little ribbon cable slot. This is actually where the L3 and R3 ribbon cable will plug into. So if you didn't solder the L3 and R3 ribbon cable, you don't have to worry about this part. So turning our attention towards the actual paddle configuration, we're going to be kind of working on the physical parts. And first off, the paddles, there's little metal pins that you can actually put through each paddle, and then they're going to snap into the paddle frame. Then with the paddles and frame connected, we're going to go ahead and attach it to the controller rear. I would definitely recommend using the one that eXtremeRate includes. For me, I really wanted to maintain the gray back. So as you can see, I modified my controller, kind of drilled and dremeled it out a bit to route through. Totally optional. I just did that for the color purposes. But if you use the eXtremeRate rear controller shell, you won't have to worry about it. There's already mounting points and you won't have to drill anything out. But I was kind of being a lunatic on this build and really wanted the factory gray controller shell. So I figured I'd at least show you guys some of the process I went through for that. So now we're going to join the two halves of the controller, and you're just going to want to put it back together as is, except you're going to route that ribbon cable tag in through the slot that is in the middle of the bottom half of the controller shell, and that's going to plug into the actual button kit that is on the paddles itself. So once that ribbon cable is through, you can go ahead and take the rear button PCB and plug that ribbon cable into it. For me, I kind of pulled the controller back apart a bit and fed that ribbon cable through just to make sure all the slack was back inside the controller and not in the rear button box. And we can go ahead and secure the rear button PCB with the screws provided. Once you've joined the controller back together, it's time to put the rear cap on, which does include a couple of the buttons for the RISE4 button kit. This part's tricky as you actually have to lay in the plastic buttons, and you do have to flip it over and snap it on to the PCB and the whole paddle housing per se. This part can be very tricky and even trickier to capture on camera, but what I ended up doing is just kind of holding the button rear cap flat in my hand to where the buttons won't spill out of it, and I just kind of took the controller, placed it over it, and then snapped it together. That way you don't have to worry about the buttons falling out if you're trying to do it the opposite way. And that is pretty much it. Before I fully button the controller back up though, I usually do apply some power and do a little test. So in this case, there is a center button on the paddle kit. If you hold that down for 5 seconds, you'll see a red light come on. If it's solid, that means it's in program mode, and that'll allow you to actually map any buttons on the front to the rear paddle kit. If you see the red light strobing or flickering, this probably means you have some sort of contact issue and it hasn't been installed correctly. For that, I would just kind of recheck your contacts and your solder points and just make sure everything looks good and see if you see anything that could be causing it. So programming is really simple on this. As I mentioned, if you hold the center button for 5 seconds, you're going to see the red light come on, identifying that it's in program mode. From there, you're going to want to simultaneously hold the front button on the controller you want to map to the rear button on the controller that you want to apply it to. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and map the square button to the left paddle for an example. And I'm going to hold them down at the same time. And you'll see the red light blink 3 times. That way it lets you know that it's been programmed and you're good to go. Once you're done programming the buttons, go ahead and hold the center button for 5 seconds until the red light goes out. and that turns off the program mode and allows the controller just to be played as normal, and you're good to go. Overall guys, installation is pretty easy on this one compared to some of the other ones I've done where there's a lot more soldering involved. And I think a lot of that's to contribute to the PS5 controller itself. It disassembles pretty nicely and is pretty easy to work in. I am impressed with the RISE4 button remap kit. So far it's been really a pleasure to game on. Build quality is really good for just being plastic components in this case. The buttons have a nice tactile click to them, and in game they're very responsive. I haven't played the widest variety of titles so far, but I can say I have used this controller for a little over 100 hours in Elden Ring, and everything's felt great on it. I haven't had any issues with the buttons. Everything's felt really responsive. And in a game like Elden Ring, where there's lots of moments where small movements are very critical, and to hit them just right, whether you're kind of doing an obstacle or in a boss fight, and everything's felt as expected with no input delays. The only con I can say to these remap kits for the PS5 controllers, and it's not the kit itself at all, it's kind of the nature and the revamps of the PS5 controller itself and the different micro iterations they've come out with, that's the issue. There are quite a few iterations of the PS5 controller that have come out, and it's made companies like eXtremeRate kind of have to work around that and provide different kits for each version of controller. So just make sure when you're selecting it, you know which controller you have and you're purchasing the right kit. There are very telltale signs and little minute details that you'll have to look out for when it comes to choosing the right kit. Luckily, eXtremeRate, if you go to any of their Amazon product pages, they'll show you little details you can look for on your controller to make sure you get the right kit. Other than that, I think this is an awesome DIY solution for your PS5 controller. And overall, I just gotta say I'm a huge fan of the PS5 controller in general. Not being around PlayStation controllers as much, I find it very comfortable. Everything feels very responsive on it. And for me, I don't own a PS5, so this has just been used on my PC. But all of this will apply to on the PS5 itself as far as using the whole button mod kit. But that is going to wrap up this one, guys. Thank you for checking this video out. Hopefully you found it helpful, and hopefully this gave you a good insight on the RISE4 Remap Kit from eXtremeRate for the PS5 controller and how it installs, and an overall review of it. If you guys want to see more tech related videos like this one, be sure to subscribe. As always guys, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.